I once read, and I promise this is relevant, that classical music is just any music made by classical musicians, which of course isn't really a very useful statement. It doesn't tell you anything. It's something of a tautology, really, but it is actually completely correct. Classical music really is nothing more and nothing less than music made by classical musicians. I bring this up only because this is sort of true for all genres. It's actually the most important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about genres. In our case, it quite simply means that psychedelic music is music made by psychedelic musicians. Of course, I know what your next question is. Well, what is a psychedelic musician? It's a mystery. Let's try to work that out in this video.
Sense of compliments, the color of time. Who cares?
So, genres are, to be fair, big, messy things, and there's very little broad agreement on what any genre is. That's understandable. There is rarely a single thing in the music itself that you can point to and say, this is precisely what makes this genre. After all, they're inconsistent and chaotic, and the lines are just too blurry. But that's okay. That's just what we humans are like with anything, right? We're a mess, and that extends to our art too. Neat categories just don't exist. This really makes my job hard though, particularly when I'm trying to talk about a genre in a reasonable amount of time, in a way that holds people's brain-rotted, social media ruined, super short attention spans. Yes, I'm talking about you, and no, do not click away. Now, I have my own views about genre and how important it is. I think a genre in all art is super important, and anyone who tells you otherwise just does not get it. But more importantly, I also think that if you're only going to talk about what genres do, so the music theory, geeky stuff of genres, then you're missing the point. Oh, this genre uses dominant chords in this way. Oh, this one does this sort of rhythm. Blah, blah, blah. All important stuff in its own way, I grant you, but this is topsy-turvy. I reckon we should instead start by asking 3 broad questions. What is this genre for? What is this genre about? And who is this genre written by? Call these questions the for, about, and by of a genre. Everything else, all that theory, nuts and bolts stuff, is downstream from these questions. Now, let's briefly look at another genre through these 3 questions before we fully tackle psychedelia. Disco. You need to know that it's for dancing, right? That's really important. That's really quite obvious. In fact, almost always also about dancing too. And, just generally having a good time. And it is a genre that developed out of funk and soul music created by Black Americans in the 1970s. Though, of course, everyone else liked it and they joined in the fun too. But that is the simplest version of the for, about, and by of disco. Without that cultural context, no amount of theory is actually going to help you get disco. Whenever you listen to a disco song or a song that is disco influenced, all that cultural and generic understanding is right there at the back of your mind, impacting how you hear the music. The theory stuff about the chords and the progressions that you hear in disco, what sorts of rhythms, it's all important, and you would want to talk about that and learn about it, but it is actually secondary. Now, for psychedelia, these 3 questions are fortunately pretty easy to answer. And honestly, this video is a little bit pointless because I suspect you already know the answer. In fact, I've already hinted at it. The for, about, and by for psychedelia is just drugs. You see, the question right at the heart of what is psychedelia really is just something like, is psychedelic music just music plus drugs? Like, if psychedelic music is just music made by psychedelic musicians, as I said earlier, then what is a psychedelic musician? Well, it's a musician who does drugs. That's it. Okay, there are slight complications and nuances to it, like, let's be frank, to be psychedelic, we need to be talking about the right intoxicants. Booze-fueled music isn't psychedelic. Cocaine-fueled music isn't psychedelic. In fact, cocaine-fueled music is disco, and I could have mentioned that earlier. And you know what? I know some people will disagree. I know some people do disagree, but as I shall demonstrate throughout the rest of this video, I'm right and they're wrong, as usual. The sole commonality between all psychedelic music is the taking of hallucinogenic drugs. And the sole thing one needs to do to make one's music psychedelic is do hallucinogenic drugs. Now, let's first look at the history and wider context of the genre. We don't know who that enterprising psychonautical caveman or woman was who first combined the musical experience with the hallucinogenic one. But as we've since found out, they were really onto something. Links between intoxicated states of mind and the arts go back to the earliest known civilizations. The Greeks had their cult of Dionysus, the Romans had their frankly rip-off cult of Bacchus, both of which were, as far as we know, all about drinking lots, getting totally fucked up, and having a good time. There's even an ancient Greek tragedy by Euripides about the newly born god Dionysus and his followers going on a mad, orgiastic killing spree. Just because it's about having a good time, it doesn't mean that everyone involved was having a good time. Loads of ancient civilizations had their own get fucked up and worship a god cult, but because ancient history is a bit, quite understandably, right, murky, we don't know exactly what was going on. We don't know exactly what kind of music was associated with those altered states. So, even though I don't doubt that there was some 6th century Welsh peasant called Bryn who ate some funny little mushrooms and made groovy sounds on a sheep bone flute while his village all tuned in, while of course turning on and dropping out, that had nothing to do with modern psychedelia. There isn't that line of continuity between him and us, with the obvious exception of Comus, of course. It's not really until the increased use of opium in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and its impact upon Romanticism that we really got into firmer ground, where we know about how drugs impacted the arts, like the composer Hector Berlioz and his opium-fueled Symphonie Fantastique. Hector wrote this revolutionary piece of music to win the heart of an Irish actress, Harriet Smithson, and it actually worked, which is weird given that she didn't actually seem to like him very much. It wasn't a very happy marriage. Anyway, according to the program notes, this symphony is about a gifted artist who'd overdosed on opium due to the pain of his unrequited love for a beautiful woman, a rather obvious stand-in for Harriet herself. The opium-induced trip then takes this artist through a ballroom, pastoral scene in a field, then he's taken to a scaffold, then he watches a grotesque witches' Sabbath scene. Yeah, it's a bit bonkers, but it's good, and one can only assume it's a little bit of an improvement on Bryn and his flute. No offense, Bryn. Though this symphony is clearly hallucinatory in nature, it's not really psychedelia as we think of it today. We really have to wait until the 1960s for that to appear. Psychedelia in art, music, literature, and culture, as we all know it now, as its own thing, evolved largely out of the burgeoning academic fields of psychology and psychiatry, mostly on the west coast of America, and it spread from there. Timothy Leary to Ken Kesey to the Grateful Dead, then the Beatles try it all out, and then boom, explosion. Everyone was talking about taking LSD and making psychedelic music and art. Psychedelic rock, psychedelic folk, psychedelic soul and funk and blues and progressive rock and everything. Today, there's psychedelic electronic music, psychedelic ambient, psychedelic everything. It's evolved a hell of a lot over the last 6 decades, and every country has its own spin on it. UK psych has always been different to American. Not to mention South American takes on it,
Precisa saber da piscina.
or East Asian, African.
Since I came to know you, baby.
In the 90s psychedelia is different to today's and different to that of the 60s, and the preferred chemical of choice has changed from mescaline to LSD to MDMA and back around. You know what? I can make 100 videos about the history of the genre and still only really scratch the surface. My point here is that it's a very diverse genre. It's all quite appropriately mind-boggling, isn't it? Which just goes to show that there is no common music theory to the genre. The only thing in common between all these types of psychedelic music is, to repeat myself, drugs. It's obvious really, isn't it? Let's get back now to those key questions I mentioned earlier, the for, about, and by. What or who is psychedelic music for? Well, let's answer this question with a joke. What did the Grateful Dead fan say when he ran out of drugs? What's this terrible music? I'm sorry. It's just a silly joke, although I think there might be something to it. Not that there's a problem with the Grateful Dead. I like them. But a lot of psychedelic music is actually for listening to while high. It's the simple reality of it. So, do you need to do drugs to enjoy psychedelic music? Of course not. Psychedelic music can be enjoyed by anyone. Tens of millions of us have enjoyed the music of the Beatles. Just to take the most obvious example, you do not need to consume LSD to like Strawberry Fields. You don't need to chow down on a hallucinogenic cactus or lick a toad to enjoy Nowhere Man or Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. This is true of psychedelic arts and culture generally. Whether that's the visual arts, film, clothes, anyone can enjoy and appreciate any of it, right? And since the 60s, psychedelia has touched everything a little bit. Trippiness is now an aesthetic unto itself, and you don't need to be a druggie to enjoy any of that. This is all obvious, right? It's kind of a pointless video. However, it would be silly to pretend that the consumption of drugs does not, on some level, change the way that psychedelic music is heard. And some music clearly is intended to be listened to while high. Ever listen to the artist Shpongle? Honestly, they're a bit annoying, but they're an extreme example lying at one radical end of the psychedelic musical spectrum, right? Well, even more mainstream stuff like the Beatles psychedelia was at least written for a society that was increasingly interested in and engaging in psychedelic experiences. The Beatles were writing their songs for anyone and everyone. Importantly, they were writing music to sell, we need to be honest about that. So while I wouldn't say that their music was for listening to while high, that's clearly far too limited an audience, it was still for a wide audience of young people whose attitudes and mores were changing with the band themselves, and drug use was a huge part of that. It just undeniably was. So, do you need to do drugs to enjoy psychedelic music? Obviously not. But it probably doesn't hurt. And we live in a world where drug taking is now sufficiently mainstream that it's just a part of popular culture. And we all know at least a bit about psychedelia on some level. The genre only makes sense as psychedelia, as psychedelic in that context. So psychedelic music is for people who at least know that it's a drug thing. And there is nothing about the music itself that is inherently more trippy or weird than loads of other non-psychedelic music. So we can't just look at the music itself to answer these genre questions. The next question is, what is psychedelic music about? This can be summed up as, does psychedelic music have to be about does psychedelic music have to be about doing drugs? This is an interesting question to me because the answer is sort of obviously, again, no. Psychedelic music can be about anything. You have love songs.
In the sunshine of your love.
Songs about friendship.
We've been friends now for so many years.
Songs about mental illness.
Manic depression is searching my soul.
Songs about societal change and unrest.
Open up the streets, got a revolution.
Songs about not really much at all.
I wanna feel them prospects on my face again.
And everything in between.
Do you realize
But actually, these are all, at least implicitly, really about doing drugs. They're all about experiencing all those other things through the lens of the psychedelic experience. Sometimes that's obvious, like Pink Floyd's psychedelic proggy explorations of mental health issues. Sometimes it's less obvious. In fact, I take that back. It's always really quite obvious. Like Sunshine of Your Love. The love song element is not important. No one cares about that bit. That's an extreme example, I guess, but similar things can be said for any psychedelic song. Precisely what the lyrics are about is secondary to what the music as a whole is about. And psychedelic music is about the psychedelic experience, even, or maybe even especially when it isn't lyrically so. Like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, their songs are more often than not nonsensical from a lyrical point of view, or maybe just irreverent and sort of trivial. I don't say that as an insult, but my point is that just because they're singing about a Gila monster or whatever, doesn't mean that they're not also making music about the psychedelic experience. As I've already said, psychedelia is now everywhere all the time. It has influenced everything and has been influenced by everything. And that's why any subject matter can be psychedelic. Even a Grateful Dead song about a groupie is actually about hallucinatory drug experiences because of the way it's played and recorded, and most importantly, the entire kind of context around it. So look, is every piece of psychedelic music about doing drugs? No, obviously not. But also, yeah, kinda. So, third question then, who is psychedelic music written by? AKA, do you need to do drugs to write psychedelic music? This is where I have to most unequivocally just say yes. First things first though, obviously doing drugs doesn't actually do anything magical or make you create different music that you otherwise couldn't. It isn't some unique or amazing source of creativity that can only be discovered by doing acid. Anyone could write the sort of music that we call psychedelic. There is actually nothing special about it. In most cases, it's very simple and certainly much simpler than the vast majority of classical and jazz. Psychedelic music is in no way more wild or out there or trippy than progressive rock, as an example, right? With which it shares a lot of history and plenty of characteristics. Now, some progressive rock is also psychedelic, like Yes and Pink Floyd, but lots isn't, like Jethro Tull. They never went anywhere near any illicit substances, in spite of what you might think looking at them. And it is the consumption of hallucinogenic drugs that makes a band psychedelic and makes their music psychedelic, or not. The fact that this doesn't do anything inherently special to the music just goes to show that it's not really just about the music. So, to be even more specific and accurate, psychedelic music really just boils down to being part of a psychedelic community or subculture, who of course mostly consume hallucinogenic drugs. Jethro Tull do not come from a psychedelic scene, even if the freak folk stylings of bands like the Incredible String Band were a big influence on them.
I'll even attack you or eat you whole.
Jethro Tull are wackier and weirder than Pink Floyd, right? But they're definitely not psychedelic, whereas Floyd often are. Some people do struggle with this a bit. It's the only reason I'm going into so much detail on this. But there's really nothing more complicated to it than what I've been explaining. So don't get too caught up just in what you're hearing in the music, which is the usual trap people fall into. Genres are as much about social groups, scenes, and cultural norms as they are about the actual music being played. Simple. Anyway, in spite of everything I've just said, let's talk briefly about psychedelic music theory. I'm not going to spend loads of time on this, but at the very least it's important insofar as, like I've been saying, it's not important. The actual musical content and even a lot of the lyrical content is not the substantive issue when we're talking about what psychedelic music is. But still, loads of people either get caught up in it or get confused by this stuff. Like, I came across plenty of music theory forum and Reddit threads during my research where people were asking, what makes psychedelic music psychedelic? And honestly, most of the replies were wrong, or right in parts, but missing the actual point. If you try to talk about psychedelic music in theory terms, you're going to go awry because there is no consistent thing that psychedelic music does. This is true of a lot of genres, if not all genres, but for psych, it is to an unusual degree. Psychedelic music almost never sounds the same, band to band or decade to decade, country to country, precisely because it covers so much ground. Anything can be psychedelic. Think of all the samples of music I've played so far in this video. There is such a wide range of sounds and feelings, even if I do personally prefer and end up playing mostly psychedelic music from like the 60s and 70s. But just to demonstrate this a little bit further, does this sound like this? Or like this? And do any of them sound like this? Not really. I saw a very well written and substantiated post on our music theory, which makes the case that disorientation is at the core of what psychedelic music is trying to do. So you might hear that in the chords, chord changes, shifting tonal centers, or sounds like flange or phasing, double tracking. It's very informative, but it's just wrong. Particularly when this user says most of it is down to specific effects. Most of it is not down to specific effects. Does a piece of music in any other genre sound more psychedelic by sole virtue of doing any of those things? When you hear the sorts of chord changes this post mentions, like chromatic medians, for example, in, say, a Beethoven symphony, do you hear that and think, that's disorienting and rather psychedelic? I don't think so. You can do some pretty radical key changes and not sound psychedelic. You can have a phased sound effect and not be psychedelic at all.
Now don't try to kid me, man cub.
And I don't think it's even remotely accurate to say that disorientation is the aim of psychedelic music. Are the Grateful Dead disorienting? Maybe sometimes, but I don't think for the most part. Is White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane disorienting? I don't think so at all.
One pill makes you larger and
Loads of psych trance or psychedelic pop and rock and funk is just for dancing to. Granted, preferably while high, but it's not disorienting. It's quite often hypnotic. However, if we were to try to tease out some music theory things we could say, what would we say? I guess I might say that, if anything, the Mixolydian scale is the closest thing to a go-to psychedelic sound you're going to find. But even here, the problem is that that's far from unique to psych, and it's really just a result of being A, such a ubiquitous scale, and B, the fact that psychedelic music draws from older genres, like blues in particular, that love the dominant Mixolydian sound. But still, a large proportion of classic psychedelia from the 60s and 70s, like the Grateful Dead and the Beatles, does lean on Mixolydian a lot. And even a lot of the 80s and 90s stuff, for example, Blind Melon, use it tons. So it is worth noting a bit. Put it like this. If you're interested in playing psychedelic music at all, you should at least learn this scale. And to be fair, things like weird time signatures, guitar effects, studio weirdness, weird chord changes, all of this, these are important elements to a lot of psychedelic music, and lots of psychedelic music loves this stuff. But none of it is necessary. Quite demonstrably, lots of psychedelic music doesn't do any of this at all. The simple fact, and here I'm repeating myself a lot as ever, the simple fact of it is that there is no music theory of psychedelic music, because you can play music however you want and just make it for, by, and about hallucinogenic, druggy shit, and it's psychedelic, okay? That's just how it works. People get way too caught up in talking about genres in specific theoretical terms like scales, time signatures, but really, a lot of the time it just comes down to, what is this music for? What is this music about? And who is this music written by? For, about, and by, He says, repeating himself for the 100th time, when music theory stuff is important, and it is always actually important to understand it, given that it is the vocabulary of music, when theory is important to understanding a genre, it's actually downstream of all of that other stuff. If you get it backwards, you miss the point. To bring it back round to where we started, psychedelic music is music made by psychedelic musicians. And they're just musicians who do a certain type of drug, really. Anyway, that's us. We're done. I will just play you out now with brief samples of some of my favourite psychedelic bits of music. I'll keep them short so I don't get hit by copyright strikes. See you around.
Underfoot the ground is patched with climbing arms of ivy wrapped around.
Groovers in the heart. Groovers in the heart.
Do even how up, down, to and fro. You have no idea. I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in.
Oh, you know all the words and you sung all the notes, but you never quite